It was a cold Friday evening in November, the kind that chills you to the bone and makes you question why you ever thought a Ouija board was a good idea. My friends and I were gathered in my dimly lit basement, surrounded by flickering candles that cast strange shadows on the walls. The mood was just right for a bit of supernatural fun, or so we thought. The board had been sitting in my closet for years, a gift from a distant relative who claimed it was an antique. I never paid much attention to it until that night. We were bored, and after a couple of drinks, someone, probably Mason, suggested we give it a try. After all, what could go wrong? There were 5 of us: me, Mason, Sophie, Lucas, and Jenna. We all crowded around the board, fingers lightly touching the pointer. The air was thick with anticipation, but none of us really believed it would work. We were just kids looking for a thrill. The pointer began to move almost immediately, sliding smoothly across the board, spelling out words that made no sense at first. Marty. We all glanced at each other, unease creeping in. None of us were pushing it, at least, that's what we all claimed. Then, the questions started. Is anyone here with us? Mason asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The planchette jerked to yes, moving with such force that we all pulled our fingers back in shock. That was the first real scare of the night, but we laughed it off, attributing it to nerves. In hindsight, that was the first mistake. The next question changed everything. Who are you? Jenna asked, her voice barely a whisper. The pointer began to move again, this time more slowly. It spelled out Darkane-SS. A heavy silence fell over us. The kind of silence that isn't just about the absence of sound, but the presence of something else, something oppressive. Sophie was the first to speak up. This isn't funny anymore. Let's stop. But we didn't. We couldn't. The pointer began moving on its own, faster and more randomly. We watched in stunned silence as it spelled out SUBMIT. What does that mean? Lucas asked, but before anyone could respond, the board started to shake violently, almost as if it was trying to break free from the table. The candles flickered wildly, and the temperature in the room seemed to decrease. I remember feeling like I was being watched, but when I looked around, nothing was there, nothing I could see anyway. We all jumped up from our seats, backing away from the board as if it had come alive. The pointer flew across the room, hitting the wall with a sickening thud. The candles blew out simultaneously, plunging us into darkness. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just a faint whisper, indistinct and far away. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from all around us. Submit, submit. The voice hissed, though none of us dared to acknowledge it. Then, the basement door slammed shut with a force that shook the house. We were trapped. Jenna screamed, her voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere, but there was no way out. The whispers grew louder, now more like growls, inhuman and terrifying. Lucas was the first to break, running to the door and banging on it, desperate to escape. But it wouldn't budge. It was as if some invisible force was holding it shut. The rest of us stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The door creaked open, the candles reignited, and the temperature returned to normal. We stood there, panting, wide-eyed, trying to process what had just happened. We didn't speak of it again, not that night, not ever. The board was destroyed, burned in the fireplace, and the ashes buried deep in the woods. We all went our separate ways after that, drifting apart as if that night had fractured something fundamental in our friendship. But it didn't end there. A few weeks later, I started noticing changes, subtle at first, but undeniable. Objects in my house would move on their own. Lights would flicker. But the worst part was the feeling of being watched, an oppressive presence that never seemed to leave me. At night, I would hear the whispering again, that same voice from the basement, growing louder, more insistent. Submit. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just stress, paranoia. But it became worse. The whispers became screams, the presence more oppressive. It felt like it was inside my head, pushing me, controlling me. I haven't slept in days. My reflection in the mirror looks like someone else, a skinny, hollow-eyed version of myself, someone who has seen too much, someone who has been emptied out from the inside. And now, I don't know what's real anymore. I hear the voice everywhere, in my house, at work, even in my dreams. It's like a shadow, always lurking, always watching. And the worst part, I'm starting to think it's right. Maybe I should submit. If you're hearing this, if you're watching this, don't make the same mistake we did. Don't touch the board. Don't invite it in. Because once you do, it never lets you go. It was the summer after we graduated from college, a final party before we all went our separate ways. 5 of us had rented a cabin deep in the woods, a cheap, old thing, perfect for a week of partying. The place had no Wi-Fi, barely any cell signal, and the kind of silence that makes you forget what the outside world sounds like. It was exactly what we needed. On the second night, after we had exhausted all the usual drinking games and ghost stories, Cassie pulled out a Ouija board from her bag. She had bought it on a whim at some roadside shop, thinking it would be a fun way to scare us. I laughed at her, called it a waste of money, but everyone else was into it. Peer pressure can be a powerful thing. So, we gathered around the old wooden dining table, the board in the center, and our fingers lightly touching the pointer. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood from the fireplace, and the only light came from the flickering flames. "Is anyone there?" Cassie asked, her voice half joking, half nervous. For a while, nothing happened, and I started to feel smug about how ridiculous this all was. Then, the pointer moved. Slowly, deliberately, it spelled out, H-E-L-L-O. Everyone laughed, assuming it was one of us pushing it, but the nervousness in the air grew thicker. We asked a few more questions, the pointer answering with clear words like yes and no, until Cassie asked something that made my stomach drop. "What's your name?" The pointer slid to the letters again, faster this time, A-M-D-R-E-W. The laughter stopped. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my back. Andrew was my younger brother's name, but he wasn't dead. He wasn't even sick. In fact, he was perfectly fine back home. "Very funny, guys," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Who's doing this?" No one confessed. In fact, they all looked as freaked out as I felt. The board was silent for a few moments, and then it spelled out something else, H-E-L-P-M-E. Now, I was genuinely uncomfortable. This wasn't funny anymore. I told them I was done, but as I pulled my fingers away, the pointer spelt the word goodbye on its own. Everyone stared at each other, wide-eyed, but we shrugged it off, convinced that maybe one of us had moved it as a joke. We were here to have fun, not to get spooked by some stupid board game. Later that night, after we had all gone to bed, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I fumbled for my phone to check the time, 3:15 a.m. The witching hour, as some people like to call it. I smiled at the thought, but my breath caught in my throat when I noticed a notification. It was a text from Andrew. "Are you okay?" it read. I replied, "Yeah, why?" No response. I stared at my phone, the light from the screen the only source of illumination. Then, out of nowhere, it started to ring. Andrew's name flashed on the screen. My stomach dropped. Why would he be calling at this hour? I answered, but there was only static on the other end. I hung up and texted him again. No reply. The call came again. This time, I answered immediately, and through the crackling static, I heard something faint, something that froze the blood in my veins. A laugh. It was Andrew's laugh, but it was distorted, slow, and wrong. It echoed through the line, sending shivers down my spine. Then, the line went dead. I was wide awake now, my heart pounding in my chest. I called him back, but it went straight to voicemail. I texted him again, desperate for some kind of response, but nothing came. The next morning, I called my mom, trying to play it cool. I asked how Andrew was doing, hoping for some reassurance. She told me he was fine, that he had just left for a day out with friends. But something in her voice made me uneasy. She asked if I was okay, saying I sounded strange. I brushed it off and hung up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We all packed up and left the cabin later that day. No one talked about the Ouija board, and I wasn't going to bring it up. But the unease stayed with me, nagging at the back of my mind. When I got home, I called Andrew. He answered on the first ring, his voice cheerful and normal. I felt a rush of relief wash over me. Maybe it had just been a weird coincidence, a prank gone too far. But that night, I had a dream, a nightmare, really. I was back at the cabin, standing in front of the Ouija board. The fire had gone out, and the room was freezing. I could see my breath in the air. The pointer moved on its own, spelling out WATCHME. Then I saw him. Andrew was standing in the corner of the room, but it wasn't really him. His face was twisted into a smile that didn't belong to him, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. His lips moved, forming words that sent a chill down my spine. I'm coming. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, but the next day, Andrew called me. His voice was different this time, lower, almost hollow. He asked if I had been watching the videos he sent. What videos? I asked, confused. Check your email, he said, and hung up. I hesitated, my stomach knotting with dread, but eventually, I opened my laptop and checked my inbox. There were 5 new emails, all from Andrew. Each one had an attachment, all video files. I opened the first one, my hands shaking. The video was grainy, dark, and disjointed, like it had been recorded on an old VHS tape. The footage showed a room that looked familiar, like the cabin. The camera was shaky, panning around until it focused on a shadowy figure standing in the corner. It was Andrew, but not him. His eyes were wrong, his smile too wide, and he was staring right at the camera. The video cut off abruptly, leaving only a deafening silence. I opened the next video, and the next, each one more distorted and disturbing than the last. The final video was the worst. It was just his face, staring into the camera, whispering something over and over. Watch me. Watch me. Watch me. I deleted the emails, but it was too late. The images were burned into my mind. I haven't spoken to Andrew since. Every time I see his name on my phone screen, my blood runs cold, and I can't bring myself to answer. The last time I checked his social media, he had stopped posting entirely. No one has heard from him in weeks. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to a phone call with no caller ID. When I answer, all I hear is static, and that distorted, creepy laugh that haunts my dreams. I can't shake the feeling that whatever we contacted that night is still out there, watching, waiting. And it has Andrew now. I don't know who or what he is anymore. But I know one thing for sure, that smile isn't his. And it never was. My family and I moved into a new house. It was an old Victorian, the kind of place with creaky floorboards, high ceilings, and too many doors. The house was too cheap, considering the size, but the real estate agent said the usual nonsense about needing some work. I've always been handy, so I wasn't too concerned. The house had charm, and I was looking forward to fixing it up. The first time I noticed something weird was during our second week there. I was in the basement, organizing tools, when I found a door at the far end of the room. It was small, almost hidden in the shadows behind some old shelving. The thing was, I could have sworn it wasn't there before. I had been down in that basement several times, and I hadn't noticed it. The door was old, painted the same color as the walls, which might explain why it blended in so well. There was no handle, just a simple, rusty keyhole. I tried pushing it, pulling it, even jamming a screwdriver into the crack to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. I didn't think too much of it at the time. Just another thing to fix, I figured. Then, a few nights later, I heard it for the first time. A soft, rhythmic knocking. It was faint, almost like someone was tapping their fingers on wood. At first, I thought it was the house settling. Old houses make noise, after all, but this was different. It wasn't random creaks and groans. It was deliberate, like someone trying to get my attention. The sound was coming from below, from the basement. I went down there, flashlight in hand, and the knocking stopped the moment I reached the bottom step. I stood there for a long time, listening, but the basement was silent. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe the wind rattling something loose. But in the back of my mind, I knew that wasn't it. The next morning, I decided to take another look at the door. It was still there, unchanged, but this time, something was different. The keyhole. There was something on the other side of it, a glint of metal. I fetched a small key I found in one of the upstairs drawers earlier that week. It was an odd little thing, rusty and old, clearly unused for years. I slid the key into the lock, and it fit perfectly. My hand hesitated for a moment before turning it. The lock clicked, and I felt the door give way slightly, as if something heavy was pressing against it from the other side. When I pushed it open, the smell hit me first, a damp, earthy stench, like soil that had been rotting in the dark for too long. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The walls were stone, cold and damp to the touch. I shone my flashlight down the stairs, but the beam seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the door, locked it again, and forgotten about it. But curiosity got the better of me. I took a step down, then another, the stairs groaning under my weight. As I descended, the knocking started again, louder this time, echoing off the stone walls. It was definitely coming from below, but the farther I went, the harder it was to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. It felt like the sound was all around me, closing in. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, circular room. The walls were lined with old shelves, filled with dusty jars and tools that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But it wasn't the room that unnerved me. It was the door on the opposite side. Another door, exactly like the one I had just unlocked, except this one was open, leading into more darkness. And the knocking, it was coming from behind that door. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to get out of there, but my feet carried me forward. I approached the door, and as I did, the knocking grew more insistent, more frantic, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side knew I was getting closer. I shone my flashlight through the doorway, but all I saw was a long, narrow hallway. The walls were the same cold stone, and the floor was covered in dirt, like it had been untouched for years. But there was something else, footprints, faint but visible in the dust, leading further down the hall. I followed them. The hallway seemed to go on forever, and the knocking never stopped, growing louder with each step I took. It was rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, echoing in the stillness. The footprints grew clearer, more defined, until they abruptly stopped in front of another door. This one was different, though. It wasn't wooden like the others. It was metal, old and rusted, with a heavy latch on the side. The knocking was louder here, so loud I could feel it vibrating through the floor, through my bones. I reached out to unlatch the door, but as soon as my hand touched the cold metal, the knocking stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, my hand frozen on the latch. I knew I shouldn't open it. Every part of me knew this was a mistake, but I couldn't pull away. Slowly, I lifted the latch, feeling the weight of the door as it creaked open. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. It was a room, small and square, with no windows and no light except for my flashlight. The walls were bare stone, except for one spot directly opposite the door where something had been scratched into the stone, a single word, over and over again, in deep, jagged letters. Let me out. But that wasn't what terrified me. No, it was the figure standing in the middle of the room, facing the wall. It was a man, or at least it had been at some point. His clothes were old, tattered, and his skin was gray, almost blending into the stone. His head was bowed, his back hunched, and his hands were bloody, the skin raw and torn from scratching at the walls. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as I watched him slowly turn to face me. His eyes were hollow, sunken, with a look of pure desperation. His mouth opened, and I realized with a sickening lurch that the knocking hadn't been from his hands. It had been from his head, banging against the wall in a slow, torturous rhythm. He stared at me, his eyes pleading, and I knew he wasn't alive, not in the way we understand life. He was something else, something trapped between worlds, and the knocking, it was his only way to communicate, his only way to beg for release. But the worst part, the part that still haunts me, is that as he opened his mouth to speak, I heard a whisper in my ear, so close it felt like someone was standing right behind me. Let me out. I slammed the door shut, bolting up the stairs, the knocking resuming the moment I turned away. It followed me up, growing louder and faster, until I burst out of the basement and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep that night, or the next, the sound of that desperate knocking echoing in my mind. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, that the stress of moving, of fixing up the house, had gotten to me. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still down there, waiting. The knocking hasn't stopped. It comes and goes, sometimes faint, sometimes strong, but it's always there, just beneath the surface. I thought about leaving, about selling the house and getting as far away as possible, but something tells me it won't matter. Whatever I let out that day, it's attached to me now. I hear the knocking when I close my eyes, in my dreams, in the dead of night when the house is still. And every time, it gets a little closer. I never believed in the supernatural. My friends and I were just bored one Friday night, looking for something to spice up our routine. That's how we ended up with a Ouija board on our living room floor, barely taking it seriously. The dim light of our old lamp flickered over the surface of the board as we took turns asking it questions, mostly trivial ones like, what's my future husband's name? Or what will I be doing next year? It wasn't until my friend Ella asked the question that changed everything. Who is the most dangerous person in this room? The pointer, a small wooden piece that moves across the board, slid slowly to spell out a name, Alex. I wasn't bothered at first. I thought it was a prank. But then, I noticed Alex, who had been joking around with the rest of us, becoming unnervingly quiet. He glanced at the board and then at us, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker. He quickly dismissed it as nonsense and left the room, saying he needed some fresh air. Later that night, Ella and I found Alex in the backyard, staring blankly at the ground. When we asked him if he was okay, he just muttered that he had something on his mind. We didn't press him, figuring he was just embarrassed about the Ouija board. Little did we know, that would be the last time we saw him before everything turned horrifying. Alex disappeared that night. We initially thought he had just gone somewhere without telling us. It wasn't until the next day, when his family reported him missing, that we realized something was wrong. We retraced our steps from the previous night, and it was only then that we noticed the strange, almost imperceptible marks in the soil in the backyard, like someone had been digging. We told the police about our night, the Ouija board, and how Alex had acted strangely. They searched the backyard, but the marks were quickly dismissed as nothing significant. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Alex grew cold. Then, one afternoon, the police called us to the station. They had found something buried in the backyard. It was Alex's phone, broken and covered in dirt. With it were chilling text messages from someone pretending to be him, sent from a number that no one recognized. They revealed threats and disturbing details about plans Alex had supposedly made, plans that included things none of us had heard before. The investigation eventually led to a horrifying discovery. Alex had been involved in something dark and dangerous, hidden from us all. A few months later, it came out that he had been part of a covert group dealing with illicit activities. The texts on his phone had been sent by someone who knew his secrets and wanted to use them against him. The authorities never found Alex's body, but they did arrest several people connected to the case. The Ouija board's creepy prediction that Alex was the most dangerous had been a cruel twist of fate. We were a group of old friends, bound by years of shared memories, late-night laughs, and the occasional inside joke that made sense only to us. This particular night, though, would be different. It would be the last time we ever got together like that, and not just because we were growing apart. It was because of what we found in the box. Dave, the unofficial host, had moved into a new apartment, one of those modern, sleek places downtown. It was a bit sterile for my taste, but it suited him perfectly. We'd done this routine dozens of times: beer, pizza, and whatever board game someone had unearthed from the back of their closet. But when we arrived, Dave had something different in mind. "I found this old game at a garage sale last weekend," he said, dropping a battered wooden box onto the table. It looked ancient, with intricate carvings on the lid that had worn down to almost nothing over time. The guy said it was handmade, a one-of-a-kind thing. Thought it might be fun. The box itself was heavy, the wood darkened with age, and the hinges rusted. It was the sort of thing you'd expect to see in a museum, not on a game night table. When Dave opened it, we were all a little taken aback. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were several items: a set of cards, some wooden tokens, and a single mask. The mask was disturbing, to say the least. It was a pale, featureless face, the kind you'd expect to see in a nightmare, with only small slits for eyes and no mouth. The material looked like porcelain, but felt like something else, something softer, like foam. A chill ran down my spine when I touched it. Creepy, right? Dave said with a grin. The guy at the sale said it's some kind of role-playing game. Each person wears the mask for a round, and the others have to guess what they're thinking based on how they move or act. It sounded odd, but we were all intrigued. We'd done weirder things for a laugh, and the idea of trying to outguess each other while someone wore that unsettling mask seemed like a good challenge. The rules were simple. The person wearing the mask would draw a card and follow its instructions, acting out whatever it said without speaking. The rest of us would guess what the card's command was. Dave went first, slipping the mask over his face. The room fell silent as the air seemed to grow heavy with anticipation. He drew a card, glanced at it, and stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost robotic. He picked up a kitchen knife from the counter and began walking towards me. For a split second, I felt a pang of real fear, a primal instinct telling me to get out. But then I remembered it was just a game, and I laughed it off. "You're a murderer, right? Or maybe a chef." I joked. He didn't respond, just kept coming closer, the mask hiding any expression. I could see my reflection in those black, hollow eye holes, and something about that blank face made my heart race. "Okay, seriously, what's on the card?" I asked, a little unnerved now. Dave paused, knife in hand, and then slowly placed it on the table in front of me. He sat back down, drawing another card and handing the mask to Sarah, who reluctantly took it. The game went on like this, each of us taking turns, the actions growing stranger, more intense. But it wasn't until my turn that things went off the rails. I didn't want to put on the mask. I felt a deep, inexplicable revulsion towards it. But the pressure from the group was too much, so I gave in. The moment it touched my face, I felt wrong. It was like the mask was suffocating me, even though it had no mouth or nose. The card in my hand felt damp, and the letters seemed to swim before my eyes. It read, "Reveal the truth." I had no idea what that meant, but as I stood up, a wave of nausea hit me. I looked at my friends, who were staring at me with wide eyes, and suddenly I knew I had to leave. Something inside me snapped, and I tore the mask off, flinging it across the room. "What the hell, man?" Dave shouted, but I couldn't answer. All I could think about was getting out of there. I ran to the door, yanking it open, only to find nothing. The hallway was gone, replaced by darkness. Not just the absence of light, but a void, like the world had ended beyond that door. I turned back, expecting to see my friends laughing, telling me it was just a joke. But they weren't laughing. They were standing in a circle around the mask, staring at it with expressions I can't even begin to describe, like they were seeing something horrific that I couldn't. And then, as I watched, the mask began to change. It twisted, warped, taking on features that weren't there before. A mouth, twisted into a cruel smile, eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. It was like the mask had come alive, feeding on something we couldn't understand. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling, and I screamed for her to drop it, to get away. But she didn't. She turned to me, her face pale, and whispered, "It's not a game anymore." That's when the lights went out. I don't know how I got out of that apartment. My memory of those last moments is a blur of fear and panic, of running through endless dark hallways that shouldn't have existed. All I know is that I woke up in my car, parked miles away from Dave's place, the morning sun glaring through the windshield. I never went back. I never saw my friends again. I tried calling, texting, nothing. Dave's apartment was listed as empty when I checked, and the landlord claimed no one by his name had ever lived there. The building, he said, had been vacant for months. I'm still trying to piece together what happened that night. Maybe it was a prank that went too far. Maybe we all just got caught up in the moment. But deep down, I know there was something more, something that came with that mask, something that wanted to be found. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment, I can feel it. The weight of it pressing on my chest, the coldness creeping up my spine. It's like the mask is still out there, waiting for someone else to find it, to play the game. And when they do, they won't be able to stop. Because it's not just a game anymore. My friends and I had been planning this game night for weeks, just a casual evening with some drinks, snacks, and a few rounds of our favorite board games. It was something we'd done countless times before, but this time, something felt off from the start. There were 6 of us that night, me, Ryan, Jenna, Marcus, Taylor, and Emily. We've been friends since college, and game nights had always been our thing. As soon as I walked into Jenna's apartment, I could sense an odd tension in the air. It was subtle, but it was there, an underlying unease that none of us wanted to acknowledge. The first game we played was one of our favorites, a strategy game that always got us competitive. We were about halfway through when Ryan suggested we switch to something more interactive, something that would really test our luck. He pulled out a game we hadn't played in years, a strange, old board game that I'd almost forgotten existed. The game was simple, involving a pair of dice and a deck of cards with strange, ominous symbols. We had found it at a garage sale years ago, but it had never been a favorite. The rules were vague, almost as if they were purposely designed to be confusing, but Ryan insisted we play it. He'd always had a thing for weird, obscure games. Reluctantly, we agreed. The first few rounds were uneventful, just us rolling the dice, drawing cards, and trying to make sense of the cryptic instructions. But as the game progressed, the tension in the room thickened. We started noticing small, unsettling details, like how the dice always seemed to roll higher for some of us and lower for others. How the cards began to feel heavier in our hands, almost as if they were pulsing with energy. By the time we were halfway through the game, things had taken a dark turn. It started with Marcus, who rolled the dice and drew a card with a single word: sacrifice. The card instructed him to give up something of value to continue playing. We laughed it off, thinking it was just some creepy gimmick, but Marcus wasn't laughing. He suddenly looked pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm not playing this anymore," he said, throwing the card onto the table. "This isn't right." We tried to convince him it was just a game, but he was adamant. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and left without another word. The rest of us were stunned into silence. Marcus was always the level-headed one, the guy who kept us grounded. Seeing him freak out like that shook us all. But the game didn't end there. Taylor, ever the jokester, rolled the dice in Marcus's place. He drew a card that simply said, "Your turn." We waited for something to happen, but nothing did. Taylor shrugged, made a joke about the game being broken, and we moved on. That's when things got really strange. Emily was the next to draw, and her card had a symbol on it that none of us recognized, a strange, jagged mark that looked like it had been scratched onto the card with a knife. The card instructed her to choose a player to take the fall. Before we could even process what that meant, she looked straight at Ryan and said, "I choose you." We all laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the game's twisted humor, but Ryan didn't find it funny. His face went white, and he suddenly doubled over, clutching his stomach. He was gasping for air, his eyes wide with terror. It was like he was being suffocated by some invisible force. We panicked, tried to help him, but no matter what we did, it didn't work. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Ryan straightened up, his breathing ragged, his face drenched in sweat. He looked at us, a mix of fear and confusion in his eyes, and said, "What the hell is this game?" We were all too shaken to answer. None of us knew what to do. We were just staring at each other, waiting for someone to make a decision. Finally, Jenna spoke up, her voice trembling. "I think we should stop playing." But Taylor, who'd always been the one to push things too far, insisted we finish the game. He said we were overreacting, that it was all just some elaborate prank built into the game. Against our better judgment, we continued. It was my turn next. My hands were shaking as I rolled the dice. They landed on double sixes. I drew a card, my heart pounding in my chest. The card had just one word on it, "End." Before I could react, the room went dark. The lights flickered out, plunging us into darkness. There was a loud crash from the kitchen, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Jenna screamed, and I felt a cool, clammy hand grab my arm. I yanked it away, only to realize it was just Emily, shaking with fear. The lights flickered back on, and we saw what had caused the crash. A knife from Jenna's kitchen block was embedded in the wall, inches from where Ryan had been sitting. The glass from the picture frame above the counter was scattered across the floor. No one had been near the kitchen. No one could have thrown that knife. We all stared at each other, the realization dawning that this was no game. Whatever was happening, it was real, and it was dangerous. Without a word, we grabbed our things and ran out of the apartment, leaving the game, the cards, and the dice behind. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air, our hearts pounding in our chests. None of us ever spoke about that night again. We stopped having game nights, stopped hanging out as a group altogether. The last I heard, Marcus moved out of state, and Jenna sold her apartment. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that game, about the cards and the symbols, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we'd finished it. But then I remember Ryan's face as he struggled to breathe, the cold grip of Emily's hand in the dark, and I know one thing for sure. I never want to find out. I used to think that winning was everything until the night I learned the terrifying truth about what it really meant to come out on top. It all started with a friendly bet. My friends and I had always been competitive, and game nights were our way of blowing off steam. That night, we decided to up the stakes. Instead of playing for bragging rights, we each threw $50 into a pot. Winner takes all. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Samantha, Alex, and Megan. We'd known each other since high school, and our game nights had become a sort of ritual. It was always fun, full of laughter and lighthearted banter. But as soon as money got involved, everything changed. We decided to play a game we'd never tried before, a strategy board game that Jake had picked up at a yard sale. It was called The Silent King, and none of us had ever heard of it. The box was old and worn, with faded illustrations of faceless figures and a crown resting on an empty throne. It looked like something from another era, but Jake was excited to try it, so we went along. The rules were simple enough. Each player started as a ruler of their own kingdom, and the goal was to conquer the others until one person remained as the Silent King. The game involved a mix of strategy, negotiation, and a bit of luck. It sounded like a good time, and with the cash on the line, we were all eager to play. At first, it was all in good fun. We joked, made alliances, and betrayed each other as the game progressed. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. The game was longer and more complex than we'd expected. The instructions were vague, and the further we got, the more convoluted the rules became. We were exhausted, our nerves frayed, but no one wanted to quit, not with that money on the table. Around midnight, something strange happened. Megan, who'd been lagging behind the whole game, suddenly started making incredible moves. She was outmaneuvering all of us, predicting our strategies before we even made them. It was like she knew what we were going to do before we did. We chalked it up to luck at first, but the longer it went on, the more uneasy we became. By 2 a.m., it was just me and Megan left in the game. The others had been eliminated, sitting back and watching with a mix of frustration and disbelief. I was sweating, my heart racing as I tried to think 3 steps ahead, but Megan was relentless. Every move I made, she countered with a perfect response. Finally, I was cornered. Megan had me trapped, my last kingdom surrounded on all sides. I looked up at her, expecting to see a triumphant smile, but her face was expressionless. Her eyes were dark, almost lifeless, as she reached for the dice. "This is it," she said quietly, her voice flat and cold. She rolled the dice, and the game was over. She'd won. But instead of the usual cheers and jeers, there was only silence. We all stared at the board, at the tiny figure that represented Megan's victorious king, and a chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Megan didn't move. She just sat there, staring at the board, her hands trembling slightly. I reached out to congratulate her, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the game piece, her expression vacant. "Megan," I said, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" She slowly lifted her head to look at me, and I'll never forget the emptiness in her eyes. It was like she wasn't there anymore, like something had taken her place. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, just a faint, gasping sound, like she was struggling to breathe. Panic set in. Jake and Alex rushed to her side, trying to snap her out of whatever trance she was in, but it was no use. She just sat there, staring blankly ahead, her breathing shallow and erratic. We called an ambulance, but by the time they arrived, Megan was unresponsive. The paramedics couldn't explain what had happened. There was no sign of injury, no indication of a medical condition. It was as if something had drained the life out of her, leaving behind an empty shell. They took her to the hospital, but she never woke up. The doctors were baffled. There was no brain activity, no sign of consciousness. She was gone, but her body was still alive, trapped in some kind of limbo. The game was never mentioned again. We all went our separate ways after that night, too shaken to even look at each other. I tried to forget, to convince myself that it was just a freak accident, but the memories haunted me. The way Megan had changed, the look in her eyes when she won, I couldn't shake the feeling that the game had taken something from her, something vital. A few weeks later, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just a plain brown box with my name on it. Inside was the board game, The Silent King. I hadn't seen it since that night, and the sight of it made my stomach turn. There was a note inside, written in Megan's handwriting. "He's coming for you next." I threw the game away, but it didn't matter. Every night since then, I've been plagued by the same dream. I'm sitting at the table, playing the game again, but this time, I'm alone. The pieces move on their own, and no matter how hard I try, I can't stop playing. I can't escape. The Silent King is always one step ahead, always watching, waiting for me to make my final move. And I know that when I do, I'll be the one who's lost forever. I always thought poker was a game of skill and chance, until the night I found out what it really costs to win. It started out like any other Friday night. My friends and I had a long-standing tradition of getting together for a poker night, just to blow off some steam after a long week. We weren't high rollers by any means, but the small stakes we played for kept things interesting enough to make you feel the loss, but not enough to ruin friendships. There were 5 of us around the table that night: me, Eric, Tom, Sarah, and Dave. We had known each other for years, and poker night was as much about the banter and harmony as it was about the game itself. We usually played in Eric's basement, which was decked out with all the essentials: a well-worn poker table, a mini fridge stocked with beer, and an old TV in the corner playing sports highlights. But that night, the energy felt different. I noticed it as soon as I walked in. There was a tension in the air, a kind of quiet intensity that didn't belong in our usual laid-back games. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just the stress of the week getting to me. We started playing around 8 p.m., and everything was normal at first. The usual jokes were thrown around, and the sound of chips clinking filled the room. But as the night went on, the mood started to shift. It was subtle at first, longer silences between hands, fewer jokes, and a growing seriousness in the way everyone played. Around midnight, Dave suggested we raise the stakes. He wasn't the type to push for higher bets, so it caught us all off guard. "Come on," he said, leaning back in his chair with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's make this interesting." We were all a few drinks in, and the idea of playing for higher stakes sounded exciting, so we agreed. We doubled the buy-in, and the game continued. That's when things started getting strange. It was as if the cards had a mind of their own. I'd never seen a game like it. Hands that should have been winners were getting beaten by improbable combinations. I'd have a full house, and Sarah would lay down a straight flush. Eric would go all in with a flush, only for Tom to reveal a higher one. It wasn't just bad luck. It was like the deck had been rigged, but we all knew that wasn't possible. The most unsettling part was how quiet everyone had become. The usual banter was gone, replaced by a tense, almost desperate focus on the game. No one was smiling anymore. It felt like we were all playing for something more than just money, though none of us could put a finger on what it was. Then came the hand that changed everything. It was close to 2 a.m., and the pile of chips in the center of the table was the largest I'd ever seen. I was dealt a pair of aces, pocket rockets. It was the best hand I'd had all night, and I knew this was my chance to turn things around. The betting was intense. One by one, the others folded, leaving just me and Dave in the game. I looked across the table at him, trying to read his expression, but his face was a mask of calm. His eyes, though, they were locked onto mine, intense and unblinking. I called his raise, and the final card was dealt, another ace. I had a full house, aces over eights. It was nearly unbeatable. My heart was pounding as I pushed all my chips into the center. All in, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Dave didn't even hesitate. He matched my bet without a word, then slowly laid his cards down on the table. Four of a kind, eights. I stared at the cards, my mind reeling. The odds of him having those eights were astronomical. I couldn't believe it. I looked up at Dave, expecting to see a triumphant grin, but instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His eyes were different. They were darker, almost black, and his face was pale, drawn tight as if he were in pain. He leaned forward, his voice low and strained as he said, "I win." At that moment, the lights flickered, and I felt a chill run through the room. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and I realized with a sickening jolt that we weren't alone. There was something else there with us, something that had been lurking just beneath the surface of our game, waiting for this moment. Before I could react, Dave slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull thud. We all jumped up, shouting his name, but he didn't move. His skin was ice cold to the touch, his eyes staring blankly at the cards in front of him. It was like he had been drained of life in an instant. We called an ambulance, but it was too late. The paramedics arrived and pronounced him dead at the scene, 'cause unknown. The doctors couldn't explain it. There were no signs of a heart attack, stroke, or anything else that could have killed him so suddenly. It was as if something had simply taken his life away, leaving behind an empty shell. The rest of us were in shock, struggling to comprehend what had happened. But deep down, we all knew it had something to do with that game, with a hand that shouldn't have been possible. We never spoke about it again, and poker night was permanently canceled after that. But the memory haunts me. I can't stop thinking about the look in Dave's eyes when he won, the darkness that seemed to consume him in those final moments. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of cards shuffling in the silence of my house, and I feel a presence watching me, waiting. I haven't touched a deck of cards since that night. I can't, because I know that if I do, I might not be so lucky next time. The game might not be over, and the next hand could be my last. It was the beginning of October, and my friends and I had planned a game night to kick off the Halloween season. We were all excited and had gathered at my apartment for what we expected to be a night full of laughter and fun. The group included my best friend Sarah, my roommate Jake, and a couple of acquaintances, Lisa and Tom, who we'd recently met through mutual friends. After setting up the games and snacks, my phone buzzed with that ominous text. I checked it and, thinking it was some kind of prank or a mistaken number, shrugged it off and ignored it. We continued with our evening, playing board games and reminiscing about old times. Around midnight, we decided to switch things up and try a new game we'd never played before. It was called The Silent Observer, a role-playing game with intricate rules that involved a secret observer in the room. The game was designed to add a layer of suspense and paranoia, and it seemed perfect for the night. We gathered around the table, each drawing cards to determine our roles. The rules were simple. Everyone was given a role, and one person was designated as the observer, whose goal was to stay hidden and silently influence the outcome of the game. The rest of us had to figure out who the observer was before the game ended. As we played, strange things started happening. Jake's phone kept buzzing with notifications, but when he checked, there were no new messages. The lights flickered occasionally, though we didn't think much of it. A few hours into the game, Lisa went to the bathroom and came back looking pale. She said she heard someone knocking on the door, but didn't see anyone through the peephole. We tried to shake off the unease and continued playing. But as the night went on, it became clear that someone was messing with us. The observer seemed to be influencing our decisions, and the tension in the room grew thicker with every passing minute. Everyone's nerves were on edge, and we began accusing each other of being the observer. Then, the doorbell rang. This time, everyone was on edge. Sarah and I exchanged worried glances. I got up to check, peering through the peephole, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I opened the door anyway, but it was completely silent outside. When I returned to the room, the atmosphere was even more tense. The final round of the game was approaching, and we were all convinced that the observer was someone among us. The accusations flew, and things started to get heated. Then, it happened. My phone buzzed again, this time with a picture. It was a photo of our living room, taken from the corner where no one was supposed to be. But what made it truly terrifying was the fact that in the background, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure that none of us recognized. It was tall and seemed to be watching us. Panic set in. We immediately started searching the apartment, checking every corner and closet, but found nothing. The game was abandoned, and we tried to calm down, but the unsettling feeling lingered. We decided to call it a night, and everyone left in a hurry, visibly shaken. Afterward, I discovered something even more disturbing. I looked through my phone and found the number that had sent the original message. It was still saved in my contacts, but it had no name attached, just a string of random letters. When I called the number, it went straight to voicemail with a message that was eerily calm. I hope you enjoyed the game. I'll be watching. To this day, I don't know who that person was or how they knew about our game night. But every October since, the same number sends me a message asking if I'm having a game night. I still have the picture on my phone, and every now and then, I take a look at it, trying to make sense of the shadowy figure in the background. But no matter how many times I look at it, the unease never fades. The first thing I remember about that night was a loud knock on the door. It was just past midnight, and the muffled sounds of our laughter and clinking glasses from the living room made me hesitate. It wasn't a friendly knock. It was urgent and sharp, like someone was desperate to get in. I glanced around the room, where my friends and I were midway through a heated game of truth or dare, the kind where the dares start to get increasingly bizarre. I shrugged it off, thinking it was one of my friends messing around. When the knock came again, this time more insistent, my curiosity got the better of me. I peeked through the peephole and saw nothing but darkness. No one was there. I hesitated, then opened the door a crack, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was out there. Instead, I found an envelope wedged into the frame. It had no return address, just my name scrawled in jagged handwriting. I picked up the envelope and, against my better judgment, opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message, "You're not alone." A shiver ran down my spine. I rejoined the game, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. As the night wore on, the dares became more intense and personal. My friend Jason was dared to call an old ex-girlfriend and apologize for a past argument. It was awkward, but he did it. As we laughed about how uncomfortable it was, I noticed something odd. The room's temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in the air. Everyone else was too engrossed in the game to notice, but I was on edge. Then came the dare for Mark, one of our quieter friends. He was dared to send a message to an unknown number and ask, "What are you doing?" He hesitated, but eventually complied. We all waited for a response. It didn't take long for the phone to buzz. Mark read the message aloud, "I'm watching you." Everyone laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as a prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing around, expecting to see someone hiding in the corners of the room. The playful mood had shifted to a tense anxiety, and the game lost its fun. Just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness. The room fell silent except for the sound of heavy breathing and the occasional whimper. The power flickered back on, and that's when I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway to the kitchen. My heart raced as I tried to make out the figure's face. It was obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the outline of someone standing there. Panic set in, and everyone scrambled to turn on their phones' flashlights. The figure was gone, but the unease had settled over us like a thick fog. We quickly gathered our things, trying to make sense of the night. Mark was the last to leave and found that his phone was gone. He checked his messages and found a new one. You didn't get the message. At that point, we were all too scared to stay any longer. We left in a rush, each of us making sure to lock our doors behind us. I couldn't sleep that night, my mind racing with thoughts of what might have happened if we hadn't interrupted the game. The next morning, I went to check the front door and found another envelope. It was the same as the first, but this one had an added note: you were warned.